school like Pathfinder, students will have access to a lot of literature, whether it be through websites or whether it be through books or whatever, but students are not explicitly taught how to read. And I can understand why that would be concerning to people. So let me explain how people come to learn to read without being taught to read. I think in our culture, because we've all kind of gone through school and school is the way that most people learn to read, we have this idea that if you aren't taught how to read, if you aren't sat down and taught, you won't learn to read. And there's a lot of literature exploring people who learn to read outside of school, whether it's before school age or homeschooled, or even adults who learn to read. And one of the big themes is that people, if left to learn in their own way, will find a way to learn to read. They'll find their own way in their own time and based on their own interest. So think about all of the things that we need to learn to read to be able to do. We need to read to navigate websites. We need to read to navigate signs, to read books, to read articles. And the idea is that at some point, people will come across something that they really want to do, and they really have to learn to read to do it. And their interest in doing that thing will often lead them to learn how to read. And here's the thing. All of these studies, really, they all seem to find a general pattern, which is that there is no pattern that applies to everyone for how to learn to read. So some people learn to read by learning to sound out words, which is kind of like the phonics approach that you see a lot in schools. And other people learn to read by memorizing whole words. Some people learn in some ways by quote unquote osmosis. They are read to a lot, let's say by their parents or friends or staff members. And at some point they just sort of pick it up. Another one of the findings in a lot of these studies though, is that people really need to learn to read based on their own interest. And that's one of the big flaws, I think, in schools. We force kids to sit down and learn to read, first of all, before they may have an interest in reading. And second of all, we tell them what they're going to read. So we're going to read this book and everyone's going to read that book. The last thing I want to say is that we're also used to, because we rely heavily on school, the idea that everyone learns to read at roughly the same time. So in self-directed learning, you don't see that at all. The studies that I've referred to before also generally show that there's no age at which people learn to read. But the good news is that whether you learn to read at 4 or 7 or 9 or even 11, once you're a little bit older, there's just no way to tell who is the early reader versus the late reader. So yes, your children will learn to read. It would be extremely strange in our hyperliterate culture if they somehow didn't get through that process learning to read, and they do not need to be taught in order to